Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula. I'm Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ, and I'm joined as always by Rob from F1 Fantasy Hub. Rob, you're heading to South Beach this weekend. How you feeling?
Adam, great to be back. 2 weeks off, but we're getting straight back into another sprint race weekend. I'm very excited. First race of the year in the US, so it's nice to have something on our time zone after a few pretty rotten starts for, China and Japan and Australia. So really looking forward to getting down there. The weather will be nice. Hopefully the racing's just as good.
We've got an exciting show for you again tonight, and let's start with the Fantasy Formula Live leaderboard because we have two teams that are tied for first right now, and they're finally starting to get to these leaders that have a traditional approach to the game. Our first few leaders this season had all used their chips in the first few races, but now these two teams that are in a deadlock for first have only used the Limitless chip. They nailed it last week in China. And then all of their previous weeks, they've just been perfect. They started the season with Perez, Red Bull, and Ferrari, and then have just avoided the DNFs and stocked all of the best back markers to get them to the point where they're P1 in the league. So congratulations to the two leaders because you've really earned it.
Yeah, fast start for these guys on screen here. I definitely think after Miami, we're going to see the leaderboards normalize a little bit once a couple of chips are out of kind of our use. And, it's obviously a great sign to see these folks at the top of the leaderboard really kind of showing everyone how it's done. I definitely think you and I are going to continue to climb a little bit more, maybe not 1, 2, and 3, but I'd like to think we can really make a push for the top couple thousand once Limitless is absorbed, which I think we could be talking a little bit more about and what that means for this weekend later in the show.
It's going to be a common theme for us tonight. And speaking of common themes, let's move over to our question for the week where you can win a fabulous prize from our sponsor, Fifth Gear Garms. How many McLaren drivers will finish in the top 5 in fantasy scoring this week? Now, we're going to talk about McLaren all throughout the show, both looking back at some great performance from Lando Norris in China in our winners and losers section, and then looking ahead to see how McLaren can reproduce those results for Miami. Rob, how many drivers do you think will finish in the top 5?
It's a tough one to call at the moment, I think, because there's a lot of talk around these upgrades that they're bringing to Miami. It's going to be the first weekend of this season. We see some probably meaningful changes in the pecking order. And, McLaren have really been building towards something the last few weeks. Lando Norris in particular after that podium in China. I haven't really seen a lot from Oscar yet to think he's capable of a top 5 fantasy finish. But if the upgrades seem to work in his favor and we look like he's on for a decent result after FP1 and the sprint qualifying, you could certainly make the case for 2, but I'm leaning towards 1 at the moment in Lando Norris.
Me too. And that's a great segue into our first winner in the winners and losers segment tonight because I picked Lando. He finished P2 in this race after getting P1 in qualifying for the sprint. He had 6 P2 finishes last year, so it's good to see Lando back on that second step of the podium, and he's got a lot of momentum going into Miami this weekend. He had 36 points, which was third among all drivers, thanks to that driver of the day, and this is the most points scored by Lando since Brazil last season, and best of all, this is his third straight race where he's increased his value by 0.3 million, so Lando really clicking on all cylinders in this race.
Yeah, he had a blockbuster result from the outset as well. Really showed his worth in the sprint race, continued that good form into the Grand Prix. His best fantasy result of the season, as you pointed out. And with upgrades coming in Miami, I think the only way is up for him at the moment. So a great result across the board. I think even though he's probably a little dearer than we'd like from him after his pretty solid second half of 2023, we may see a few eager strategists move to try and get ahead of the curve in the coming weeks if these upgrades seem to look the part.
Rob, who was your first winner?
I, much like you, chose another driver on the podium in China. Max Verstappen was my winner for China, one of 2 in fact. He came away with 58 points, a great result, his best of the season so far, and the highest score among all drivers in a single race week in 2024. I think Max, at the moment, you just can't look past the guy on a sprint race weekend as your 2x DRS boost. I know there's been a little bit of toing and froing between us and other fantasy strategists as to whether or not he's worth a place in our team on those non-sprint weekends. But I think everyone who elected to go with him for China had their decision vindicated. A great result across the board, and it's really hard to even discredit his fantasy potential in any weekend, let alone a sprint weekend.
It's great that you have Max in this space because we tend to celebrate these really special results even for him. He only scored 58 or more points 4 times last season. It's his highest fantasy score of the season. A rare, unique, special race for Max. So definitely deserving of one of our winner spots this week.
Yeah, really happy for him and really hoping he can continue that into Miami. Who's your second winner for China?
I might have given you a clue with my shirt tonight, but my second winner is Sir Lewis Hamilton. P2 in the sprint, P9 in the Grand Prix. His 11 overtakes were the most by a driver in any race this season, and his 30 fantasy points are more than double any race he's had all season long, so a great result for Lewis. And now with Mercedes teasing some upgrades this weekend, I wonder if they're about to take the corner, so fingers crossed for Lewis.
Yeah, they're definitely slated to deliver something hopefully more improved than from what we've seen in the first few races. But like you said, a really good result for him, 30 points and the highest score between both Mercedes drivers through 5 races. So if those Mercedes upgrades are looking the goods, then I think he's very deserving of a position in many a Limitless team come Miami.
And speaking of Limitless teams, Rob, it looks like they were your second winner. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of talk around whether or not China was the right track for that Limitless chip, but everyone that took a punt on that chip, arguably the most powerful in the game, was handsomely rewarded. Of the optimal teams, that triple Ferrari, triple Red Bull, and Lando Norris was the most optimal team. 456 points. You could also substitute Carlos Sainz in place of your second winner, Lewis Hamilton, to tie that number. So 456 points was probably about 100 or so points more than the best non-limitless teams, which you and I were running in China. And it goes to show that if you can time that on a sprint weekend and it pays off without a single DNF or a glaring error, then you can really shoot up the ranks. A lot of people came from outside the top 30 or 40K into the top 5,000. So it's just clearly very impressive, the kind of performance and results the correct use of that chip can have. What were your thoughts on people putting in a good result on Limitless in China?
Like you said, Rob, it's not often that the Limitless will give you the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 best drivers on the grid, and you can predict it so easily. So those strategists definitely paid off that used that chip. What's funny, too, is those of you that signed up for the Zhou Guan Yu Mini League and used the Limitless chip are now in a 1,000-person tie to see who's going to get those signed Zhou merch. So it'll be interesting to see who wins that. So I think they might be my first loser that I didn't put on the board, whoever has to sort out the Zhou contest. But in reality, my first loser this weekend was Oscar Piastri. And I think by comparison to Lando, Oscar's performance at China wasn't as good as we were hoping. And a P8 finish from Oscar might not sound that bad, but it was only 12 fantasy points for him this weekend. 12 fantasy points on a sprint is light, especially when we consider there were 11 drivers that finished with more points than him, and those drivers included Magnussen, Zhou, and Gasly. So this is what we were worried about when Piastri was priced up by the Ferrari drivers to start the season, that even if he has these decent results, his points per million isn't going to quite add up to those Ferrari drivers. In fact, Piastri's PPM is exactly half of what Sainz's is at the moment, 3.6 to 1.8. So he's not quite living up to that value yet.
No, I don't think so. And that's going to be the biggest concern we see for these McLaren guys until such time that their price either regresses or, in Lando Norris's case, kind of continues or gets to a point where it's just unfeasible to own. So, which is kind of already at that point right now. So it is a shame that Oscar and Lando by extension are not really template or meta favorites for now. But I do think that even though Oscar's turned in, a double-digit performance through all 5 races this season, it's just not really enough when you've got the likes of Sainz, Leclerc, even George Russell, you could make a case for kind of outscoring him at a very similar price point. And unless these upgrades suddenly overhaul the performance of the Papaya, which, I wouldn't entirely write off given what we saw from them halfway through last season, it's going to be hard to make the case for an inclusion in our teams anytime soon.
We'll be hoping that those McLaren upgrades we talk about in just a moment will help Oscar. But tell me about your first loser for this week.
I had Valtteri Bottas, which I, like several others, ran in our China sprint teams. It was more a case of what I could do with the budget available after I brought in Max Verstappen, and Bottas is now the cheapest asset in the game after going down 0.2 million with that DNF in the Grand Prix. He finished the weekend with minus 14 fantasy points and just hasn't really been able to put together a weekend fantasy wise that's made me want to jump at owning him. I've only been gravitating towards him as a driver in my team because of the fact that budget has inhibited me from going for better or higher priced assets. And that minus 14, even though I did run the no negative and it kind of erased that deficit for my points, certainly didn't help my budget at all heading into Miami. And I'll be running this same team for my budget if I do ultimately go down the limitless route this weekend. So not a great result for him. Minus 14. He's scored less. He's averaging less than 0 points per race. Only worse. The only driver worse is Daniel Ricciardo. So not a great omen for him heading into race 6 this year.
And for Valtteri, I think when you look at his scores per race this season, 0, -1, 2, 8, -14, it's definitely been a tough start to the year. And when you consider a similarly priced driver like Logan Sargent, Sargent's on 9 straight Grand Prix that he's finished. So has he taken the corner, and is now Valtteri below Logan Sargent for some of those budget options? It'll be an interesting question for you and I if we use Limitless and have to go back to a budget builder coming out into the next Grand Prix.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of kind of budget fodder going around at the moment, and it can really ruin your weekend if you pick the wrong one. And speaking of it, another driver that's really been in the mud lately, give me your second loser.
Oh, it's poor Daniel Ricciardo. And I didn't realize, Rob, before I talked to you that I picked 2 Australians, so sorry about that. This is the second race in a row that Ricciardo retired early from an incident that wasn't his fault. -9 fantasy points. And even though he was starting to look better on the weekend with that new chassis, maybe some improved form, the fantasy gods don't care. Another negative result for him. Like you mentioned a moment ago, he's now last in scoring in F1 fantasy. He's last in points per million, and he's 20th out of 21 drivers in value gain this season. So definitely a tough start to the season for Ricciardo. But interestingly, 39% of teams still run the guy. So I have him here as a warning to all of you that still have him. Get him out of your teams. There are so many better options, and we're going to tell you about a few later in the show. Daniel Ricciardo, can't trust him yet.
It's time to go, Daniel Ricciardo. You're certainly right, Adam. He's had an absolute stinker of a season so far. His head is on the chopping block at RB at the moment. There's a lot of speculation he may not even make it into 2025 after being touted for that second Red Bull seat. So not a lot of confidence to take from his performances, and certainly as a fantasy asset. One of only 2 drivers with Bottas to average less than 0 points per race week. So I think it is, if you still own him, I think he's definitely on the outer as it right now.
And Rob, as your second loser, you have a constructor. Tell me a bit about Aston Martin.
Yeah, Aston Martin definitely had, I would say, one of the more underwhelming performances for a sprint race weekend. I was expecting a little bit more from them after results of 35 and 32 in Australia and Japan. And Alonso looked in the box seat for a very good result in the sprint race, and then had his I guess Grand Prix kind of turned on its head a little bit too, going back a few positions as well. So not a great weekend. He did come away with the fastest lap, which also went into Aston Martin's points kitty of sorts. But, you know, it is very much dependent on Stroll just holding up his end of the bargain, which he just wasn't able to do in China. And Alonso, a very mixed weekend across the board for him. So even though 29 points was still good for the 5th best overall constructor for the weekend, the fact that Alpine and Haas were within striking distance goes to show that they have really not got much left to offer in terms of a constructor at this point, when you've got the likes of Ferrari and maybe McLaren after Miami really kind of putting in the work. And you can just obviously compromise on having another premium driver if it means getting rid of Aston Martin.
I'm glad you mentioned how close Alpine were to them, just 1 point less than what we saw from Aston Martin. And you mentioned earlier the Fernando DNF in the sprint. Between that DNF and the positions lost in the Grand Prix, there were 24 positions lost in total. Fernando classified in the sprint, so it's considered positions lost instead of a DNF. Just a mess of a weekend for Aston Martin. And As we look ahead at McLaren and Mercedes bringing upgrades to these next few races, Aston Martin could get left in the dust if they don't step up their game in the early part of the season. So I would definitely move away from them. For those of you that are still holding on as a super budget builder, I would start moving into the traditional point scoring lineups, leave Aston Martin behind, because I think McLaren will be taking the next step up soon.
Yeah, definitely. I think you mentioned McLaren, and that segues very nicely into our hit list. Do you want to take us through it?
Sure. Our first hit list item tonight are those big upgrades for McLaren. So the MCL 38 is supposed to get an upgrade that improves rear tire degradation. And that's so important at this circuit because Miami's going to be hot this weekend. There are a lot of slow corners and it's a rear limited track. So McLaren's upgrades are going to be put to the test right away. And Rob, this upgrade package is so important because last year McLaren were back markers, brought in their first major package, and then were contending for podiums the rest of the way. Do you think this upgrade package has that kind of upside?
Yeah, look, I think it might be a stretch for me to say they're suddenly going to be P2, but they're really not that far off P2 at the moment, all things considered. The one thing I will say that works in their favor is that they have flown under the radar quite a bit so far, and Lando Norris's podium in China was their first real result. I mean, obviously they had that great result in Australia, but part of that was obviously due to the attrition of Verstappen and the Mercedes duo going out. So I think this will really be quite telling if they can make the most of these upgrades, and they certainly could put Ferrari to the test if they seem to work out. I'm not so sure I can confidently say they'll suddenly be pushing Max for wins race week in, race week out. And because of their price, it makes it very hard to accommodate. But for Limitless, which we're going to get into a little bit, I think we could see more than just Lando Norris in some of our teams if these upgrades look decent.
You hit the nail on the head. For teams that have non-chip use this week, I don't recommend bringing McLarens in just yet. They're still very expensive. Lando's the second most expensive driver in the game, McLaren the second most expensive constructor. And also, we found last year, even with that revolutionary upgrade package, it took 2 to 3 races before we started to really see the huge benefits of it. So I wouldn't jump until you start seeing the results ahead of time. And as for those of us that are using the Limitless chip, I think Lando makes a ton of sense as the number 5 driver in that lineups. So let's talk about the chip conundrums this week, Rob. So let that Limitless chip, you talked about it earlier, 456 points with the lineup you see here, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 best drivers on the grid. Do you think we can run it back for Miami and you and I can run Limitless?
Yeah, look, I still think if I had to decide right now that the team you're seeing on screen here is the team I could likely run in Miami, do I think that they're going to be the top 5 highest scoring drivers in Miami? I'd say it's a fair chance, to be quite honest with you. Mercedes would really have to take a pretty significant stride forward with their upgrade package to give these guys on screen here any reason to be concerned fantasy-wise. But the pressure is on Limitless users. These 5 guys got through China completely unscathed, not a single DNF between all 7 assets. And the fact that we're going to a circuit which, even though there were quite a number of overtakes and no DNFs in 2023, there wasn't that extra sprint session. And we know that that one extra session on a race weekend always comes with an extra bit of risk where there's a higher chance of a DNF for any driver across that extra session on the weekend. So I'm not suggesting that that's a major risk for any of these top drivers and constructors, but the pressure is certainly on Limitless users, you and I included, to deliver a handsome amount of points.
The bar is really low for you and I because for anyone who hasn't heard this story yet, we used our Limitless chip at Coda last season, and that's where Lewis and Charles had the disqualification. We also had the Mercedes constructor, so those DQs hit us in 3 different places. So really, anything's an improvement here, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed for this weekend.
Yeah, definitely. I think, though, at this early stage of the season, where the pecking order is pretty evident to me that even if we do see a little bit of change with the upgrades, I'd still hazard a guess that the top 5 by the race weekend's conclusion will probably be the top 5 from China as well, all things even.
Rob, the other chip that's really popular for sprint weekends, you and I used it at China, and that's no negative. We had Hulk lose 7 positions that got wiped off the board. Bottas lost 3 positions in the sprint and then DNF. So we saved 30 points from the no negative last weekend, but I'm not quite sure we want to use it in Miami. You had mentioned a moment ago, no DNFs last season. The weather reports, I'm seeing mixed forecasts right now. Some are sunny, some have a little bit of rain, but I don't think it's going to be that risky. And this track typically has a predictable running order. So I'd save no negative for these races later in the season as these engines start to break down and we have some more mechanical failures.
Yeah, fully agree with that. I mean, I can't fault anyone for wanting to use Limitless. If you're running a team, if you're not running Limitless, if you're running a non-Limitless build, for going no negative, if you've got double Williams, double Sauber like I had in China, there is going to be some risk when you're running back markers, regardless of the track you're at and the conditions. But I do think, to your point, there may be more optimal times in the season. And we've talked about perhaps the opportunity for a Brazil track, given it's a sprint race weekend. Always seems to be a bit of wet weather there. Later in the season with those mechanical failures, it almost seems like a perfect storm to save the no negative chip for then, if you can prepare yourself to wait. I don't know if I've got the patience for something like that, but the theory makes sense. And if you don't want to use it in Miami, I think leaving it for the second half of the season is certainly a good option.
Rob, you and I are thinking about the Limitless chip this weekend, but we're not the only ones. So we had F1 TV's Laura Winter on our show last week, and she is leaning toward using Limitless at Miami this weekend. Laura and I are locked into this fantasy face-off because we rolled up to China with the exact same lineup and exact same chips. So we agreed to roll this contest into Miami, into Imola, or as far as it needs to go until one of us stands on top. So good luck to Laura this week. I can't wait to see what team she rolls out for Miami.
If she's going Limitless, Adam, I would hazard a guess you guys might have to wait until Imola to see a different result, because if what we saw in China was anything to go by, I definitely think Triple Rebel, Triple Ferrari, and Lando Norris are going to be the popular picks for Limitless. So Laura on Limitless, you guys may have to wait another week before we can split the winner.
We've got Pride and Fifth Gear Garms merch on the line, so nobody's going to budge until we have exactly the right lineup for us. Now, Rob, there's a team that I want to bring up that I haven't talked about since our preseason content, and that's Alpine. I'm going to stay on them until this take finally comes home for me. They had a really great turnout in China. Esteban Ocon's P11 was Alpine's best finish of the season, and this is after Ocon received that new floor. In these new cars, the floor can generate up to 70% of the downforce, so it could be a really big change. And both Alpines had their highest score of the season in China with double-digit outcomes. So do you see Alpine taking the corner here?
Maybe. I feel as though it might be one or two races too early. I mean, I don't know necessarily if they fit into a lot of teams at the moment, because there are so many that are hamstrung by these Max Verstappen lineups with Ferrari and Red Bull, and that very much leaves Williams and Sauber as kind of your first rung of picks. If you can stretch to someone like Gasly, for example, the Haas drivers, if you can get to them, even potentially, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head who else might come to mind, but there's maybe more out there right now. I will say, though, Gasly and Ocon both had price rises in China, and that was Gasly's first of the season. So if the upgrades do continue to work and they can continue to build on that, because the floor was so low for them to start the year, they could come good. I'm not suggesting they're going to be consistent points finishers, given the car still seems grossly overweight, but I still think they could be a handy differential if you want to go against the grain and you need someone to do something a little differently than the classic template picks you're finding in the Haas drivers, Zhou, Bottas, etc.
And I think you hit the nail on the head of part of why I'm looking ahead at Alpine, because now that we're settling into a Max Red Bull Ferrari lineup, there aren't too many opportunities to build budget. So the next frontier for us is to find these teams that bring upgrades that move them up the grid, and then that way we can get more price upgrades while keeping that strong points build. Last year it was McLaren and AlphaTauri. Could McLaren and Alpine be that first wave in 2024? And you can see on the screen there are a few options if you want to move out of drivers that are underperforming on your team now. We talked about Daniel Ricciardo being on almost 40% of teams, so that could be a pretty low-risk move if you want to try it now. But if Gasly gets the floor this weekend and we see both Alpines contending for points, I think they'll be on more lineups soon.
Yeah, definitely. I think Gasly's probably the easier one to justify, if I'm being completely honest, because if we look at Ocon, I mean, both scored pretty equitably in China, but very few. I mean, maybe you did point out before that there's over 30% of people still with Ricardo. I think Ocon makes for a very handsome swap there, but I think K-Mag's probably a little harder to justify. The guys had a price rise in every single race week so far this season, and Haas are just looking like a completely different beast to where they were 12 months ago. But I think Gasly, there's a bit more optionality, slightly down the pecking order in terms of price. He's back to where he started the season, so it's not like you've lost any ground on him in terms of pricing. So I think Gasly, for me, if I had to choose between the two, is probably the slightly more attractive option at the moment.
And Rob, before we move on, let's talk about the FanAmp pick of the week this week, which is which one of these Alpine drivers is going to qualify the highest this weekend. This is a tough one for me, but I think Gasly is going to come out of the chute with the new upgraded floor and outqualify his teammate.
That's great. I think he's probably deserving of a good qualifying result, given it's been a little bit of a slow start for him through the first few races of the season. And Ocon has certainly looked like, for me, the better of the two. But do I think the upgrades work in favor of Gasly? Maybe they do. I'm just not so sure yet what to expect from him. So I'm going to go with Esteban Ocon. But it's pretty evenly split. These guys are, toe-to-toe with one another this season.
FanAmp will be giving out prizes all season long for all of these race-by-race pick'ems, so make sure you join and answer all the FanAmp Pick of the Week questions today. Rob, let's get into the cost cap discussion. Because in our off week last week, I polled our Twitter users on what is your current cost cap, compared it to some of ours, and I thought the results were very interesting. So you can see Rob and I at the top here, hanging out around 108, 109 between the two of us. Those are pretty average cost caps for teams that are performing around the top 5% like we are. But look at some of our viewers. We have Saco de Oro with the pot of gold there with 113.8 million, which means, I looked this up, they can afford Red Bull, Ferrari, Perez, and Sainz this week. What a huge, huge team, and something we need to aspire to with our cost cap these next few weeks.
That is a monstrosity of a team if you're able to get triple Ferrari and Red Bull into your team. I definitely envy anyone with budget like that. And I mean, it goes to show viewers of the show are certainly making gains in budget and in points. So if that's not a reason to tune in for our shows, I'm not sure what is, Adam. I'm very envious that you've got even 0.7 more million than I do. I think, like you say, though, it's probably about average, maybe just a tad above average, but I wouldn't say it's by much. And there is really not much in it between the budget drivers at the moment. It's really whether or not you can get to max on a sprint race weekend with Red Bull and Ferrari as the real difference maker at the moment. So I think given that we can both get to that is probably the first and foremost priority for our teams. And then let the budget drivers kind of fill out the rest of your team if you've got enough to equip your team with those guys. But incredible work through only 5 races to get more than 2 million price gain per race. Just incredible results. So applause to the guys on screen.
And there were some replies that were jealous of these big scores, and we should have a message for them too, because it's a long season. There are a ton of opportunities to gain cost cap. Rob and I have run very similar teams all season, and the only reason I have more cost cap than him is that 1 or 2 chance budget driver that had a good race that went up in price. So you can have those good luck hits throughout the rest of the season. And then we've talked to you a little bit earlier about these teams that are bringing upgrades, and that's your next best chance to build cost cap. So it's a long season. Don't give up. And just having a high cost cap doesn't mean you're going to win necessarily. So stick with it.
Yeah, the name of the game in fantasy is points first, budget second, or at least I wouldn't say it's every race or over the season, but it certainly holds true. I think at the end of the season, I'd rather have more points than budget.
Rob, we're live this Saturday for our first Saturday live show in a while, and I have an important question for the chat. If you're watching this on YouTube, I want to hear your answer down in the comments section. I planned for this live event to be at noon Eastern, so I put a post up on all my socials last week saying, I just got Lewis Hamilton's new vegan non-alcoholic tequila, and I'm going to drink it on our live show and give you all a little taste test. Then we decided we're going to have our live show at 8 a.m. on Saturday. So now my question for the comments section is, what should I drink on Saturday? Should I have it straight? Should I have some sort of tequila sunrise? I want to know what you think.
I feel as though with Terry on the show, he's probably going to want an espresso martini, given he's all about coffee. So maybe keep that in the back of your mind, Adam. But if I'm out of the track on Saturday, I may need some liquid courage of my own. So I'll certainly take any recommendations from you or the viewers.
It's Cinco de Mayo weekend, so I am steadfast about drinking that tequila. I just don't know how I'm going to do it yet, so I want to know what all of you think. Rob, safe travels down to Miami this week, and same to all of you that are traveling for the race. And for everybody else, we'll see you right here on Saturday.